welcome back to our fifth installment in this series entitled Testing, Bringing the Structure and Evaluation Together. And just to remind ourselves what it is that we've been doing so far in the last video, we were talking about this idea of being able to find the underlying structure, discover what is hidden beneath the surface, right? In this case, which is the logical structure of the thesis. It is not obvious, it's not on the surface, but if we take our time, we're able to actually identify what the logical structure is. And we illustrated it by way of the simplest version of it. Right? Drinking coffee makes Vanessa happy. We have a coffee cup, a smiley face, and an arrow. Right? That is essentially the underlying structure. And we further abstracted it away by simply calling those two objects A and B. The point being is that we actually do not need to care about the objects themselves insofar as the content is concerned. But our concern instead should be on the relationships, how the objects are related to each other. And so we can see then that any argument we are able to break down into these two parts, a set of objects and relations that connect those objects. Now, those relationships come in many flavors. So we can have the positive one, where A causes, brings about, increases, or augments B. Negative, A prevents, eliminates, decreases, or deflates B. Can be neutral in that A shapes, purifies, carries, and squishes B. And last, we can have membership. A belongs to, occurs within, is a member, and is attached to B. So we see here that there are many types of relationships that can connect any two objects to each other. And so the reason why we are interested in this, the reason why we want to identify the underlying structure, is first and foremost, we want to understand the argument. And so in that respect, we have got to be able to look past the content. Second, once we have identified the underlying logic, we are now in a position to understand what precisely the author must be able to prove. And so given these two, that is the reason why we care so much about really structuring the thesis. And so with that, let's get started. Just like I said in the last video, I left you with this thesis right here. And what we're going to do now is break it down. We're going to go through it systematically, just like we did with the thesis in the previous video. And of course, at this point, as I said, if you haven't done it already, I would encourage you, stop the video and give it a try. All right? Okay, so I'll assume you've given it a try. So let's go ahead and get started. So just like we did before, we're just going to ignore everything for now. And the thing we are after now is we're going to be looking for the words that signal a relationship. And here they are. Birthed, caused, developed, and control. Those are the terms indicating some kind of relationship. And so we're going to go through each one of these and then reconstruct the underlying argument. So let's go ahead and do that. So we paste it to the top, make it smaller so we can actually highlight it, the sort of visual version of it in the bottom. So here we go. Let's start with this first relationship term, birth. Right? Just like we did before, we're going to ask, well, something birthed something. What did the birthing? Right here, the British Industrial Revolution. Right? So the way we can indicate it is as this. Right? The British Industrial Revolution being the object, and here, just for convenience sake, I changed birth to saying gives rise to. But the meaning, of course, is the same, right? Just to make it a little bit more obvious. The second then is, well, okay, the British Industrial Revolution gives rise to something. What is that something? Right here, vast urban slums. And we'll indicate it as another object. Vast urban slums. So here we have it, our first relationship. British Industrial Revolution gives rise to vast urban slums. Good. So now we can move to the second relationship. Right here, caused. Something caused something else. What did the causing? Vast urban slums. And we already have that object right here. Now that is doing the causing. And what is it that it is causing? Moral panic among the upper class. So we're going to describe that entire thing into one object so that we get this relationship right here. Okay? Vast urban slums caused morally panicked upper class. That is what the vast urban slums are doing. They produce this thing called a morally panicked upper class. Good, so we have the second. So let's move on to the third. Something developed something. What is doing the developing? The morally panicked upper class. We already have that. Great. And what is it developing? Right here, a system of social institutions. We'll indicate it just like this. Morally panicked upper class developed social institutions. Good. So we have that as well. Now we have something interesting. And that is schools, prisons, and hospitals. And in this case, they're not causing anything, but instead they're indicating a form of membership. Right? It's literally to say that schools, prisons, and hospitals make up, belong, or are members of this broader term we call social institutions. And the way we highlight it, or the way we going to formalize it here, is to simply connect them by way of these dotted lines. So dotted lines in this case indicate membership. Okay? So here it is. Schools, prisons, and hospitals belong to or make up this thing we call social institutions. So we actually know what they mean. Now let's move on to our very last relationship, and that is control. And here it is. Something controls something else. So what is doing the controlling? Right here, social institutions. And what is it that they're controlling? The vices of the new working class population. So we can draw it up just like this. And the last thing that is sort of implied here, not stated explicitly, is that the working class population lives in the urban slums. Now, if you thought of this as a membership, I think that's fine. Right? That working class population, that object, belongs to this other object we call urban slums. So whether you put an arrow in the way I did, or you put in a dotted line, I think it's either way is fine. But nonetheless, point being is that now we have specified all of the objects and the relationships of this thesis. So as you can see here, right, we can now understand what is going on. We see the underlying structure of this thesis statement. And what is critical is, just like I said before in the last video, is to be able to look past the content. That is, in this case, right, we can actually get rid of the objects, right, and instead just simply replace them by some generic marker. A, B, C, D, E. Right? And notice, the integrity of the argument still holds. It does not change. In fact, it even illuminates, it highlights, it draws our attention to the actual relationships. Right? So that means here, what does it say? A gives rise to B, B causes C, C develops D, D consisting of D1, D2, D3, and D controls E. And lastly, E lives in B. That is the argument present here in this thesis. And here we are able to identify it, understand it. And this is critical. And as I said before, this part oftentimes highlights flaws in your own logic, flaws in the author's logic, where you can look at it and say, well, wait a minute. I don't think A gave rise to B. Well, I don't think that B caused C. Or asking, well, how does B cause C? In fact, we will be coming back to these kinds of questions later on when we're looking at the scope dimension of this thesis. But the point really here that I really want to make clear is that we do not need to know the content of the objects to understand the argument. So let's go ahead and continue. So here we have it, British Industrial Revolution and all of its relationships. So now what have we done? Well, we've successfully revealed the logic underneath the surface, which is great. Now let's move on to the second, and that is, let's illuminate the component parts that must be proven. So here we have the thesis again. Right? You can see the various objects and relations. What we're going to do now is we're going to make it smaller so we can map it onto our two-dimensional graph, right? The thesis evaluation graph. And what we're going to do is we're going to begin by focusing on the argument dimension. And remember, our goal is to move all the way up to the third. So let's see how well this thesis scores on this. And just by way of a reminder, I mean, we've covered this in a previous video, but just to remind you again, right? When we're talking about a thesis, the argument dimension, right? What is it that we're saying? Well, we're saying that your audience is initially in place A. And here you are pointing, desiring your audience to take this journey all the way to place B. That is the destination. That is what you want to do. And if you do that successfully, you've done it. Good job. Congratulations. But as we said before, the problem is what? There's some kind of barrier, right? Some hesitation that your audience has. That is, it's not enough to simply have a destination. We also need to be able to address the audience's needs, their concerns, for our audience to actually take the journey to our destination. So let's see how this thesis does along these 2 points, destination and addressing the audience concern. So let's begin with the destination. What is the destination here? What is it that the author of this thesis wants the audience to accept? What premise? And it is this, that social institutions control the working class population. Okay? Or we can state it like this. Schools, prisons, and hospitals emerged because they helped control the vices of the new working class population. That is the destination. That is the key thing that the author is trying to have you accept. And notice in this case, this is contestable. It can be proven wrong. Well, what about the concerns of the audience? What about those? Well, when we think about the concern, we can ask the following questions, for instance. The audience may ask, well, why do we have schools? To make sure that all citizens have equal opportunity to succeed in life. Makes sense? That's plausible. What about this? Why do we have prisons? Well, because criminals must be punished. It makes sense. And lastly, why do we have hospitals? Because sick people need to be healed. That's why. Notice each of these answers to these questions are plausible. So that means our audience holds these beliefs, and what the author must do is be able to address those beliefs in some shape or form. Need to speak to them. Let's see, does the author do that? Yes, the author does. Right here. We're seeing that the argument is saying what? Social institutions were not developed because of some kind of sense of justice or being a good Samaritan or any of these kinds of things. No, the author is saying that instead these things were developed because there was moral panic among the upper class. They're the ones who developed it because they were what? Abhorred by this thing called the vast urban slums. And so if you think about this, if the author makes a successful case for the morally panicked upper class that have developed the social institutions, well then by default, the previous concerns of our audience must be either wrong or in some sense be trivial. Right? In other words, the author is actually addressing the concerns of the audience. And so with that then, the author has done a good job, and guess what? Address the concerns, and now the audience can finally take the journey to the destination. Congratulations, you have done what we set out to do. So we finished on the argument dimension, and clearly we can see this is a really good thesis. This is contestable in that it has a destination, and it has a persuasive intent in that it addresses an audience concern. But let's now look at the scope condition. What about this? Well, currently, the way that our circle is located is suggesting that this entire thesis, with all of its objects and relations, can be proven in a matter of 3 pages. Do you think that's the case? If your answer is no, well then your intuition is right. You're correct. But let's delve into why that is the case. So what we want to do is we're going to now look at the scope condition. And we're going to ask ourselves, what are all the kinds of things that the author must be able to address and prove to the audience in order for that thesis to be valid? Well, the first thing that the author has to do is this. The upper class at the time was in fact panicking. Prove it. Right? Notice that for the entire thesis to work, this has to be true. If the morally panicked upper class was not actually panicking, then nothing else follows. They do not develop the social institutions. Social institutions aren't there to control the working class. So right here, the author must be able to prove to us that the upper class was in fact panicking. That takes a bunch of pages right there. Second, the panic was actually caused by the slums and not some other factor. I mean, think about this. If the panic were to be caused by, let's say, wolves or bears, well, would that have the same consequence? No. I mean, why would the upper class, panicking that they're bears and wolves, start developing schools and hospitals? Maybe prisons, but schools and hospitals? I mean, what do you set the bears into school and thereby control them? No. It would be ludicrous. It would be nonsense, right? So in that respect, the author has to convince us that it is indeed the case that the vast urban slums caused the moral panic. Otherwise, we're not able to complete the chain. Again, that takes a whole bunch of pages. Third, the spread of schools, prisons, and hospitals was spearheaded by the upper class. It's not that the schools, prisons, and hospitals was built by somebody else, right? That the upper class just sort of took over. No, this thesis is saying that it is the upper class, they're the ones who developed it. So you have to show it to me, prove it to me. Here, the upper class saw such social institutions as credible solutions to their problem. Now think about this. The point we're making is that, well, the upper class is panicking, looking at schools, prisons, and hospitals, and they see that as a solution to the problem that they're facing. Well, can you show it to me? Can you show me that the upper class actually saw that as a solution? Or did they just sort of stumble across it? So this is about intentionality. If you're saying that the upper class developed it as a means of control, right? Show it to me that they actually saw it as a form of control, that they recognized it as such, and then proceeded to develop it. Again, without that convincing, it's going to make your thesis much weaker. And lastly, that those social institutions actually displayed control. I mean, with prisons, it's rather obvious. I can lock you up and thereby control you. But schools and hospitals, especially hospitals, right? I mean, you're there to be healed. Like, how is a hospital a form of control? How are schools a form of control? Those things aren't obvious. So again, you have to convince the audience that these things, these social institutions, actually had a commitment towards controlling. Again, that takes a whole bunch of pages. So here we can see then that in order to do justice to this thesis, there's a lot of things that the author actually has to be able to prove. A lot of things. And hence, 3 pages is not enough. It's impossible to do all of this in 3 pages. So we can see that where the circle is currently located is not appropriate. Right? Instead, where it should be is way over to the right, way over here. In other words, this thesis, for you to do justice, you really have to do it in the context of a book. That is how many pages you will need to really thoroughly prove all of these objects and relationships. So now here we have it. We went from this thesis statement in the beginning to having then broken it down into its objects and relationships. And now we are finally able to place it, as we just did, in our thesis evaluation graph. Which is great. That is exactly what we wanted to do. But you probably are sitting there right now asking yourself, okay, I see it, I understand. But what would this look like if we were to actually scale it down? So here is a scaled down thesis. The primary reason for the moral panic among the upper class during the British Industrial Revolution was the rise of the working class slums. Here, just as we did before, we're going to break it down by first ignoring all of the content and instead begin with just the relational terms. So here we have it, reason and during. So starting with reason, something is the reason for something else. Right? So what is the reason for something? Well, something is the reason for the morally panicked upper class. And so we can now indicate it as an object, just as we did before. Now, what is the reason for the morally panicked upper class? Right here, the rise of the working class slums. And we can indicate it as this. Rise of the working class slums causes morally panicked upper class. And notice what we did here. We changed, instead of using the word reason, I changed it to caused. And did so just because it indicates this relationship more clearly. But the meaning is essentially the same, and therefore we can make this kind of change. Now the second relationship here, during, is a membership relationship. So that means that both the rise of the working class slums, it causing the morally panicked upper class, is all happening during the British Industrial Revolution. And as such, this is a membership. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to say that, okay, we both know, right? We know that the British Industrial Revolution serves as the context. This is not something we're going to try to prove or argue for. We simply take it as the context. And as such, we're going to, for our purposes, simply ignore it. It's a background assumption that we're going to be making here. And so what we're left with then are these two objects in this one relation. And as such, we can see then is clearly that when we compare our thesis now to the thesis from the previous one, that there's quite a drastic change. Now you can see at the bottom we have tons of objects and relations, and at the top we've reduced it just two objects and one relationship. So you can see there's a drastic reduction in the complexity of our thesis. We can see, right? We can see that just how much of it we cut off. So down here, we pretty much cut out this entire part. We just got rid of it. And then secondly, what we did is we took what was down here, really two objects. So the new working class population lives in the vast urban slums, and we consolidated those two objects into just one at the top, the rise of the working class slums. And with that, we can now see just how much we cut out. Right? We started with the one at the bottom, and we cut out this entire section and reduced it to just these two objects in their relationship. Now, that is not the only thing we did. If you now ask yourself, well, what is the destination? What is the premise? What is the ultimate place that the author is trying to take you to in the thesis above? Well, it's this. The rise of the working class slums caused the morally panicked upper class. That is the premise. That is the point the author wants you to accept. Is it the same in the thesis below? No. Below it is that social institutions control the new working class population. That is the goal. That is what the author wants you to accept. Right? And so we see already that there's a change in the destination, where we are trying to take our audience. So we can even indicate this more clearly. So as we saw before, here we have the destination for our elaborate thesis. Right? Schools, prisons, and hospitals emerged because they helped control the vices of the new working class. And now we've changed it to this. The morally panic in the upper class was caused by the rise of the working class slums. Secondarily, how then does this new thesis of ours address the audience's concern? Well, let's see. So this thesis says what? The primary reason for the moral panic among the upper class. And that is the key term right here, the primary reason. Ask yourself right now. You can stop this video and ask yourself, well, what kind of concern is that statement right there addressing? So go ahead and think about this. Okay, I'm going to assume that you have given it a thought. And here is a concern of the audience that this is addressing. Namely this. Were the working class slums really important in triggering a moral panic among the upper class? This is the underlying question that we are now addressing in this new thesis. And what our thesis is saying, yes, it absolutely was. It was the primary reason for the panic among the upper class. The primary reason. And that is what we're going to be convincing our reader of. And so therefore, we've addressed our audience concern. And with that, our audience can now take the journey to B. The barriers have been broken down. Our audience will go, get to the destination, and congratulations, we've done what we set out to do. Great. And so we can see then from a previous illustration with the elaborate thesis, where the circle is at the top right, now with our new thesis, where we've radically reduced the number of objects and relations, well, what will happen? We can now move that circle way to the left, all the way out here. Okay? There's sufficiently few objects that we can actually do justice to them in a matter of 3 pages. Now, you can do it in a matter of 2, maybe 1 page, but you won't be able to go very deeply into the objects and their relationship. But you could pull it off. And conversely, you can also spend more time on it, 5, 6, 7 pages, to really delve in and really give your audience a good understanding. Right? So what we see then is that there's some wiggle room here. And so we can indicate it as that. Right? So this thesis with 2 objects and 1 relation, we can treat somewhere between 1 and 5 or 6 pages, depending on how deep we go into it. So here we have it then, right? A radically simplified version of our previous thesis. So now let's recap, because it was, again, a lot of things that we've done here. So think about what we've done. Just actually look at these terms: thesis, structure, evaluation. Try to remind yourself, ask yourself, looking at this, well, what is it that we did here? All right. So here's what we did, right? We started with a thesis, a normal thesis. One was elaborate, the other one was simplified. And then from there, we went to the structure. Right? We've identified the underlying logic. And in identifying the underlying logic, we were able to see all of the objects and their relations. And with that, we were able to see, well, what are the component parts that need to be proven, which allowed us to place it on our thesis evaluation map. Right, so this is what we want to go through, these series of steps: thesis, structure, evaluation. So with that, I'm going to leave you, and we'll see you hopefully in the next video.